So hopefully you guys got a chance to try out and implement all of the appropriate solutions for converting our application over to the Apollo client's local storage from React Redux. Now, if you manage to complete it, excellent job. This is definitely an extremely challenging topic because there's so much new stuff that we have to do with Apollo client, and there's a lot to wrap our heads around regarding resolvers, setting types. There's just so much with Apollo client. If you didn't, that's also perfectly fine. Practice makes perfect. The more you try it, the more you dig through those docs, right? The more you look at these solutions, the better you'll come out with an idea of what it is that we have to do. Now, I'm really proud of you because you guys have done so much in this course already. You've worked with the context API. You've worked with React Redux. You've worked with Redux Thunks. You've worked with Redux Saga. You've worked with the GraphQL and Apollo client API. You've worked with Firebase. This is actually way more than most React developers will ever even touch up until this point. You are pretty much, as far as having touched features go and touched a lot of this React ecosystem goes, you've done pretty much more than almost 70-80% of most React developers out there. So I'm really proud of it, and I want to take this moment to really congratulate you on making it this far. Now, as a final note, there's a couple things that I want to mention about Apollo client as well as GraphQL. Now, it's really hot. It's a really hot topic in the React development world. In the backend world, it's also really interesting because so much has happened with GraphQL that it's introducing this new way, a new standard of doing things. And it seems in some way to be offering a lot in its value proposition. Those benefits that I showed you guys at the start of this section about how it fixes some of the issues with REST is a very valid solution. And it's got a very elegant theoretical value. The problem, as you have seen, is that it's quite extensive. It's actually pretty verbose, and the way that we have to do it is a little bit more strained. And that's not to say that it's wrong. That's not to say that it's bad in any way either, because React and Redux is in itself a pretty steep learning curve as well. The big problem with Apollo, I find, is that it's hard to get that level of adoption because you have to get the whole team on board with it, including your backend team. So it's very possible that there's new companies that will come out that might start with a group of really senior developers in the backend and the front end that have gone through all this and see the advantages and want to implement it and take a stab at it, and it turns out really well. The problem with this is that they're charting new territory. So that's the main trade-off, is the increase in complexity in setting it up, especially on the back end. Setting it up in the back end is a little bit more complicated than how it is in the front end here. So from a business perspective, it's a cost that companies might not be willing to take a stab on with such new technology. As a converse to that, how it impacts you on the front end is that the Apollo client or any other front-end client that consumes and helps manage caching this data that you're fetching from GraphQL is still also new technology. And this comes with two main caveats. The first is that the community around these problems that you might encounter are going to be pretty new. With React Redux and with Sagas, this technology has been used so extensively and fleshed out so much that generally any problem you encounter, there's probably somebody who solved it numerous times or asked this question numerous times, solved the problem in all kinds of ways, that it's really easy for you to get unblocked. Because you simply go online, you might check Stack Overflow, or you might check the actual GitHub issues related to the React Redux library, and you'll find that the solution is right there. And it's very well documented, right? And it's really easy to implement and understand. Whereas with Apollo Client, it's still relatively new. That's not to say the community is not avid, but again, it's literally a matter of the length of time and the amount of projects that have adopted this product to scale. So those are the first things to consider. The second is that this paradigm might change. New features and new patterns might completely shift in the coming years. As you've seen, the Apollo team is trying to move away from this higher order component style of tackling what it is that we did earlier with the query and the mutation. And if you looked at my solution actually with the checkout item container, you'll see that I did it with multiple mutations here. So in a very similar way, the Apollo team is trying to move away from this and use more of that stacking style that you saw of nesting components. Now, these are pretty much just the caveats and my opinions on this. I definitely think that in one way, it's good to keep an eye on Apollo, but you should primarily still consider React Redux to be your bread and butter because so many enterprise applications are using React Redux. The increase in complexity is worth the trade-off. The trade-off for that increase in complexity is that your application is way more predictable, right? You have amazing community support around Redux. And honestly, as applications scale, the Redux architecture really does scale very well. So this is pretty much another thing to consider, is that the way that you architect out your folders, you architect your application, you set up all of your files, you think about where things need to go, that has been tried and tested. And it's worked at really, really large scale applications. That's not to say that these new technologies like Apollo and GraphQL won't get there either. But at the same time, it's literally a matter of waiting it out and maybe seeing and keeping your eye on it. So hopefully this was very useful to you. This GraphQL lesson is definitely one of the more complicated sections that we have. But again, I definitely think you've really leveled up if you've gotten this far with this course. So with this, we're wrapping up our GraphQL lesson, which I hope you got a lot out of. And we'll tackle some of the final things in wrapping up our course in the upcoming next few sections.